I was pleasantly surprised to find out that Janet is actually from Indianapolis. This is her home, and she commutes here quite frequently when she gets a chance to get away from D.C. Prior to joining EPA in November 2009, Janet was executive director of Improving Kids Environment, Inc., the children's environmental health advocacy organization based in Indianapolis, and was also an adjunct faculty member at the Indiana University School of Medicine, Department of Public Health. From 1993 to 2005, she held several leadership positions in the Indiana Department of Environmental Management's Office of Air Quality and was the office's assistant commissioner from 1998 to 2005. Prior to that, Janet served as Assistant Attorney General for Environmental Protection for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and Assistant Secretary for Environmental Impact Review. Janet grew up in Washington, D.C., and is a graduate of both Harvard undergraduate and Harvard Law School. So that handles the formal introductions, but I would like to just add a personal note. Exelon has been actively involved in all the air regulations, generally intervening on behalf of the EPA to sort of balance out some of the business perspectives that are offered during this litigation. So I've seen Janet talk many times on the Clean Power Plan. And regardless of where you stand on the issue of climate change and CO2 emission reductions, et cetera, I will say this, that Janet has made herself completely accessible. She travels constantly to either appear before state environmental agencies, environmental NGOs, and industry. So and it's certainly in that vein that she's here today. So please, let's take advantage of Janet being here. She will take questions at the end. And please join me in welcoming Assistant Administrator Janet McCabe.
That was very nice. It was also very nice for you to decide to have your conference here in Indianapolis, so I could sleep in my own bed. I really appreciate it. It's been a long 7 years, it seems like. But I do get around and about quite a bit out in the world outside of DC to talk to groups like yours and to other stakeholder groups, industry, community organizations, state and local governments a lot, tribes and everybody that's interested in air quality issues. And it's really, really important. We can't do our work if we're not out talking with people and hearing the concerns and the questions that people have. In addition to sessions like this that are a little bit more formal, although you'll find I'm a pretty informal person, so we can proceed that way. I try to be absolutely accessible to any and all stakeholders who want to come in and sit down and just talk through things. And if you find yourself in that situation, I am indeed quite easy to find, and will certainly make time for you if I can. And if I can't, there will be plenty of people on the Office of Air Quality staff who would be happy to do that. So I know you've been sitting through a lot of meetings. You've probably had way too much coffee already and not seen the sun for some number of days. And it sounds like you talked a little bit yesterday, or a lot yesterday, about the very things I'm going to talk about, because usually what people want to hear from me is what is going on with these rules, what's going to be happening, what can we expect over the next 6 months or a year or even longer. And so that's usually what I do, because when I try to get all philosophical, people are bored. And they just want me to talk about what's going on in the EPA. So I will do that, and hopefully what I will say in terms of the status of things will match what you heard yesterday. Let's hope that that's the case. If it doesn't match, I'm right, and whatever was said yesterday is not right. But before I start talking, though, it's I think always helpful to kind of remember why we do all this stuff. And I want to thank you, actually, because I understand, I've looked at the agenda, there's a lot of you guys are, a lot of you seem to be the implementers in the world. The direction comes from wherever, from the government, from your corporate headquarters to do certain things. Technology needs to be applied, software needs to be changed, plans need to be made in order to achieve those goals. And I think a lot of you guys are the people who do that. So I thank you, because we can sit in Washington and write all the rules we want and defend them in court and all that, but if there aren't people on the ground actually putting them into force, then it hasn't accomplished anything. So a week or two ago, I got to go with Administrator McCarthy to a local primary school to attend an air quality flag program. And I don't know if you are familiar with the air quality flag program, but I bet you're familiar with the air quality index, which is the rainbow colored guide that says whether the air quality is good or moderate or unhealthy for sensitive people. We have 6 schools here in Indiana that participate in the flag program. When I was at Improving Kids Environment, I helped one of them on the south side get involved in that. And what happens is that every day the kids look up what the air quality index is, and then they have a set of flags, and they go run up the flag that represents the color of the air quality that day. And it's a really great program for the kids. They get to collect data. They get to do a flagpole, what's more fun than that? And the flag flying at the school is a little bit of an advertisement for their neighborhood. So they're doing a service for the moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and brothers and sisters in the neighborhood. And when we went to do this, it was the first Orange Day. It was a couple weeks ago when we had, at least on the East Coast, we had a really bad couple of days of very, very hot, close weather, and a lot of high ozone around the region. And those kids, they were on it, man. They knew exactly what was going on and why this was important. And they knew that they had friends and family members with asthma who were affected by ozone. And it was both sad that we have to do this, but also heartening to know that these children are aware of this and are taking part and are thrilled to be able to be participating in such a great way. So a good reminder of why we do this. We do this because air pollution makes people sick. It is particularly harmful to people who are vulnerable, elderly, young children, people with disease. It has huge costs on our society and on people's quality of life. And we are fortunate in this country that we have, over the last 4 decades, brought air pollution down to the levels that we have. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure to travel to Asia. I was in China for the first time earlier this year and saw firsthand what happens when you don't have the kinds of protections that we have in this country. And we used to have air quality like that. We don't anymore, and we're very glad that we don't. So we've made a lot of progress over the years, but as I'm sure you've heard people from the government say, there's more to be done, and indeed there is more to be done. And our job at the Office of Air Quality is to implement the Clean Air Act to achieve those goals, and to do so in a way that is based on science and data, is consistent with our legal authorities, and is done in the most transparent and open way possible. And as I said already, our programs are always better when we have a full engagement of people who have something to say and something to offer and data to provide on these issues. And I hope that we walk that walk as well as talking that talk from your perspective in the way we do our rules. So I will talk about a handful of programs that are pretty active right now, and if I miss any, it's not because they're not important, it's because I didn't want to take too much time, and I'm going to count on Bill to wave at me or something if I'm going on too long, because I don't want to get you too way off schedule. So I'll start with the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan is the cornerstone of President Obama's Climate Action Plan. The President himself is very, very committed to the issue of climate change, a global challenge almost like we've never seen before. And in 2013, he put out a very proactive plan that called upon agencies all across the government to use the authorities that they had to put in place programs that would do 3 things. reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted by facilities in the United States, help develop programs so that people living in the United States will be able to adapt to the climate change impacts that are already happening and will get more severe as time goes on, because we know that they are happening already, and they will. And also to make sure that we were putting ourselves in the position of being leaders globally. Because we know that this is a global problem. Countries like China and India need to curb their emissions as well. And it's very hard for us to stand on a high horse and tell them they need to do that if we're not doing it ourselves. So there were a lot of aspects of the Climate Action Plan that touched many aspects of the way you can tackle these problems. The EPA had a very large role, has a very large role in the Climate Action Plan, which we're honored and proud about. And probably the key element of it was the Clean Power Plan. So I know you talked about this a lot yesterday. My old pal from my Indiana days, Dan Weiss, said that he had a table yesterday talking about the Clean Power Plan, and I'm really glad that you did that. These are the first national standards to control carbon from coal-fired power plants, and is designed to fit within the trends already going on in the industry, because that's the way Section 111 of the Clean Air Act works, but help push our energy supply system to cleaner, less carbon emitting generation by 2030. As I'm sure you also know, the Clean Power Plan, which was finalized last summer, has been challenged by numerous parties. It's also being defended by numerous parties. We expected that this would be the case from day one. In fact, I think we probably set the record for the more lawsuits filed and dismissed, actually, before the rule was even final than any other rule I'm aware of. People just kept filing lawsuits. And finally, once the rule was final, they could file one that was actually timely, and so that is moving forward. But there has been no court has spoken to the substance of the Clean Power Plan. It's all been sort of process stuff, including one very, very important process step, which is that in a surprise move to, I think, everybody, the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, earlier this year, stayed the rule while the litigation was pending. So if you've been around this business for a while, you'll know a couple things. One, this is not the first time that a court has stayed an EPA power plant rule while it was being challenged. In fact, the two most other significant rules, well, I shouldn't say most, two other significant rules, what was known as the NOx SIP call and the cross-state air pollution rule, were both stayed by the courts while they went through the legal process. They were both ultimately upheld and are now being implemented. So this is not unusual. This is a big deal rule. Nobody is pretending that it's not. And so for a court to say, let's just put it on pause while we get all this sorted out, is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and not unexpected, except that the Supreme Court usually doesn't step in, but it did. So what does that mean? That means that right now, nobody has any obligations under the rule. States don't have obligations and utilities don't have obligations, and there is nothing that EPA will do that will require states, because states are the regulated entities, so to speak, under our rule in terms of putting together clean plans under 111D. Nothing that we will do while the stay is in place is intended to or will require states to take any particular action to implement the Clean Power Plan. However, as I said, the court did not speak to the merits of the rule. No court has spoken to the merits of the rule. The stay affects the rule. It does not affect other activities that EPA might have underway related to the utility sector or climate. It certainly doesn't affect states, many of which are continuing to move forward with their plans to address carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, because it is within their obligation to protect the public health by moving forward with those plans. And we have been asked, and indeed stand ready, to assist states and any other parties that need our help with respect to these issues. So we continue to provide assistance when we're asked. We continue to develop resources and tools that people have indicated would be helpful to them. And we also, and this is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, want to be ready. We believe that the Clean Power Plan will ultimately be upheld by the courts. I know many people disagree, but we do believe it will. And we want to be ready for everybody to be able to implement it when that happens. So we will be doing things like moving forward with what's known as the Clean Energy Incentive Program. This was something we finalized in the Clean Power Plan last summer that was intended to incentivize early action. The program begins in 2022, as I expect you know. But in 2020 and 2021, if there is early implementation of certain kinds of technologies, the Clean Power Plan allows those to be effectively early credit. And the focus of the Clean Energy Incentive Program is wind, solar, and energy efficiency in low-income areas, areas where we know there have historically been more barriers than other areas to implementing energy efficiency programs. So we left a lot of the design details to a future rulemaking in the rule last year, and we have been working on a proposal to fill out those design details. That proposal is in the interagency review process right now, which is the step that we go through before we can actually put a proposal out, but we expect to be putting a proposal out very shortly, and I'm sure that it will have skywriters and stuff, so you'll know when it's out. The kinds of things that proposal will do is put some more refinements around some of the definitions, eligibility criteria. There were questions about how much early credit would be available to these different activities. How should we design the mechanics of the program so that it works well and smoothly with the kinds of programs that states are going to be wanting to develop. We conducted a lot of informal process to get input all last fall and into the winter. We got a lot of great input, and that has very much informed the proposal that you'll be seeing soon. So look for that. Another activity that we're working on that people are very interested in is model rules. So we put out last fall a proposed set of model rules that states, if they choose, if they want to proceed this way, could adopt, and they would, if the model rules are finalized, they would know that if they designed a program that used those model rules, it would be approvable by EPA. We have a long and very collaborative partnership with the states on the whole enterprise of air pollution reduction that involves EPA setting expectations and then states generally having the flexibility to achieve those goals however works best for their state. But oftentimes states will say, EPA, will you just tell us what you are expecting, give us a model to work from? And we're happy to do that too, with the understanding that states are still free to not use it at all or to use it and make adjustments to it as appropriate for their own purposes. So we got a lot of comment on the proposed model rules. We're working through those comments. Again, very, very helpful. In particular, people are interested in us finalizing model rules for both a mass-based approach and a rate-based approach. I hope you know what those terms mean with respect to this rule. Everybody's well, I won't say everybody, but the vast majority of people seem to be very interested in states being able to set up programs where the utilities can trade with one another across state lines. So as you know, there's a lot of complexity with designing these programs, and so there's a lot that goes into this. We also collectively have a lot of experience on this kind of program, in part because of the rules I mentioned before, the NOx-SIP call and the cross-state air pollution rule, where and acid rain, where the utilities are used to trading allowances back and forth. So we'll be moving forward with some next steps on the model rule. Don't know exactly what those will be or what the schedule will be, but you can be looking for that, and then we'll be all over everywhere talking to people about that. So again, that's about all I was going to say on the Clean Power Plan, except to reinforce that if your company is interested, is thinking about these things, and you would like to reach out to us, you should just do that, because we're definitely willing to, anybody who comes to us for help that is not violative of the stay, and we want to make sure that we answer your questions. A couple of other key programs that affect the utility industry that I'll mention. One I used to talk about at length. I'll talk about very briefly today, the mercury and air toxic standards, because that rule is coming close to the end of its very long journey, I believe. This started back in 1990 in the Clean Air Act amendments, when Congress set up a program for addressing hazardous air pollutants like mercury and arsenic across the universe of industries in the United States. And it's taken a long time to get to where we are with the utility toxics rule. It is in effect now. In fact, almost all companies are in compliance with it now. There are just a few that needed a little bit of extra time. What has characterized the mercury and air toxics rule in our world a lot the past couple of years is litigation, residual litigation. And the Supreme Court did take issue with one decision that we made along the way, which was at what point in the process we considered cost. And they said we should have considered it earlier in the process than we did. So we've done a review of the cost information to be consistent with the Supreme Court decision, and we finalized that in April. And so that's where we are now. We have been challenged on that, and so that will be, I hope, the last piece of litigation that we'll go through on the mercury and air toxics rule, and we can all move on. I do think that the mercury and air toxics standard has been another example of the creativity that the industry brings to problem solving. Through the course of developing that rule, there were concerns about the expense that would be required and the significant capital expenditures that would be required to control mercury. And lo and behold, the industry found much more cost-effective ways to get those reductions, thanks to people thinking through these issues in conferences like this and companies all across the country. So I think that there's a success story there, and the result is we have less mercury in the environment from these facilities, as well as a bunch of other air pollutants. One rule that is more active is our transport rule update. This is a rule that affects the eastern part of the country, and it is the next incremental rule after the cross-state air pollution rule dealing with interstate transport. I mentioned that I was at a school flag day in D.C. a couple of weeks ago. D.C. And lots of other places have high ozone in part because of pollutants transported from states upwind of them. We happen to be standing in an upwind state right now. I've worked in upwind states and downwind states, and of course every state is upwind to somebody and downwind of somebody else. So this is, there's a reason why this is referred to as the good neighbor provision. The cross-state air pollution rule represented incremental progress towards meeting the ozone and particulate matter standards, but it didn't get all the way there. We have areas in the country that still don't meet the 2008 ozone standard, and they're obliged to do that. Those states are obliged to do that, and they need help from their upwind neighbors. So the transport update rule will provide that next increment of reductions. These programs focus on cost-effective reductions. And so far, the most cost-effective reductions of NOx and SO2 in the east on the stationary side continue to be power plants. And so the transport rule would require that next increment of reductions. And in a pretty quick time frame, because these downwind states are on a clock to meet the ozone standard by 2018. When we looked at the technologies that were available to reduce NOx primarily in the short term, we found some actually, because there are a number of facilities in the eastern part of the country that have installed pollution controls and are not operating them. And the reason they're not operating them is because the budget system that they're currently under is sufficient to cover their emissions even if they don't run their pollution controls. And that's a result of emissions coming down for a variety of reasons over time, which is a good thing. But it means that there is pollution control equipment already installed that could be, with some effort and some expense to get them going again, started up again. That's a lot different than having to build from scratch. And so we got lots and lots of input from people on the costs, on the timing, on particular facility-specific information, state-specific information, and we're cranking through all that, and we expect to have that final rule out by late summer this year. And you'll know when we're getting kind of close, because it will appear as having been submitted to the Office of Management and Budget for the interagency review. So that will be coming, and again, we'll make sure that we're on the road and available to talk to you when that happens. A couple of other things. Particulate matter implementation. So we have a number of rules that we do that set specific standards for industry emissions, like the transport rule. We also have a number of rules that lay out the rules of the road for states as they are developing what's known as their implementation plans when they have areas where air quality doesn't meet the health quality standards. And PM is one that a number of areas are focused on. EPA revised that standard in 2012. We will be finalizing soon the rules of the road for states to do that. And those states will, with non-attainment areas, will then be able to move forward. They already are, in many cases, with what they need to do in order to meet the PM standard. Most of the comments that we get on those kinds of rules, frankly, come from state and local governments, because they're the ones that are putting these plans together. But they're certainly of interest to everybody because they may affect you. Likewise, but a little bit behind in time, we're working on a similar rule for the ozone standard that was recently revised in last fall, in 2015. It revised the current ozone standard of 75 parts per billion to 70 parts per billion. Just so you know the status of that, the first thing that happens after a standard is revised is that the states and EPA work on figuring out where in the country air quality doesn't meet those standards. The first step is for the states to give us their recommendations, and that will happen on October 1st of this year. They get a year from the date that the standard is finalized, and then EPA has a year to work back and forth with the states to come to agreement or make a final decision on where those areas are. These are things that you can kind of get a sense of where the areas are likely to be, but not entirely, because they're based on actual air quality data. So everybody knows what their air quality, or you can find out what your air quality data is. These designations will be based on air quality data from 2014, 2015, and 2016. So of course we haven't had a full summer of 2016 yet. So we won't know exactly those areas. But we also will have out in the fall timeframe our proposed rules of the road for how to plan for ozone attainment. Just two others. Do I have time for two others, Bill? And then take some questions? Startup shutdown and malfunction, known as SSM. I don't know if folks are familiar with that. This is something that a number of states are working on right now, and I know that a lot of utilities are interested in what's going on with those activities. It turns out that, I mean, we've been at this business for quite a long time, many decades, and it turns out that a number of states have the residual language in their rules that is really not up to date with current expectations of how pollution reduction requirements are carried out. And in particular, there were a number of situations where states would have rules that would say, well, all of these things apply, but the commissioner can waive them. And, or all of these things apply, except they don't apply during startup, shutdown, and malfunction. And we've just come so much further than those sorts, the need perhaps back then for the ability of somebody to just waive requirements, that EPA was asked by advocacy groups to tell states that they needed to fix those things. And when we were too slow doing that, they sued us, and And so we're now telling the states that they need to fix those things. We're working very closely with the states, but there are a number of states that are working on revising their state implementation plans to resolve that kind of stuff. Now, we realize that this is not just words, especially when it's startup and shutdown, because these are times when your facilities are operating and you need to know what the rules are. And if the rules there were no requirements during those periods of time, and now states are having to figure out what those requirements would be, that is meaningful to you. And I know that the states are working with their industry to work those things out. These are all solvable things. Permit amendments can be done to make sure that they're the right requirements in there, rule revisions can be done, and that's all happening. The states are required to give us their plans that show how they fix these things by next November. So they're actively working on that, and you may, in fact, yourself be, I had 3 things, sorry. SO2, another one of the ambient air quality standards that's, I think, very present for utilities right now. The SO2 standard was revised in 2010. It had not been revised for several decades. And the science showed that health impacts were present at relatively short-term exposures, 1-hour exposures. The previous standard had been a much longer time frame. And so this has caused some swirl in the system because, of course, it's a lot more challenging to meet a 1-hour expectation than a 24-hour expectation or an annual expectation. We are in an elongated process of identifying areas across the country where there might be SO2 violations, and we're just about to finish a second increment of designations related to that. I will say that most of the areas, not all, but many of the areas for sure, where there are SO2 problems or potential problems that deserve some looking into are around the coal-fired power plants. So you may, in fact, be working on these issues in your states. That we have one set of designations that are already made, and the states are busily working on how to resolve those issues, and then we'll have another set of designations coming out in a couple of weeks, and then there will be a couple more rounds when the states do some additional data gathering. The last substantive area I'll mention, and then I'll stop, is regional haze. I think this is more of a Midwestern crowd, is that right? This is a huge, huge issue in the West. It is a national program. Congress put this program in because human-caused air pollution was impairing visibility in our national parks and wilderness areas. And Congress felt that that was not the legacy that we wanted for our country, and so they set a very Congress-like and ambitious goal that we should eliminate man-made haze from these important national areas. But it's on a very long trajectory. So we've been working for the last 10 years, I would say, state by state, on plans to address haze. The issues are pretty different depending on the part of the country you're in. But this is like interstate transport, where it's the opposite of many hands make light work. You know, many facilities make lots of pollution. So one individual facility is not going to create an observable difference in the Grand Canyon Park. But when you put hundreds of them together all across the West, they sure do. And so all of those, Congress said, need to put on reasonable controls, and then states need to have an iterative process to make sure that those emissions are getting closer and closer to background levels as time goes on. We've been through just about every state with that first round of reasonable controls. We have a few states that we're still working with, Texas, Arkansas, for example, Utah. And then the states will start their next round of planning. We just put out, and I'll commend to your attention if you don't know about it, a set of proposed revisions to our regional haze rules. Now, having done this for 10 years, a lot of lessons have been learned by everybody about how to make this process better, smoother, more streamlined, how we can be clearer about expectations of what should be in the state plans so that we have fewer disagreements, I hope, about what should be in the plans and whether they're approvable when they come in, and so that the regulated community will understand what might be coming for them. One important thing that's in the proposed rule, we are proposing to delay the submittal date of that next state plan by 3 years. Right now it's due in 2018. We're proposing to delay it until 2021. Each of these plans out for a decade. So the decade would remain the same. But the reason that we're proposing that is because we recognize that with the Clean Power Plan, with SO2, with some states dealing with PM and ozone non-attainment areas, with the mercury and air toxics rule, that has been a lot coming at especially the utility industry in a compressed period of time. And wouldn't it be nice, where we have the flexibility, we don't always have the flexibility, but where we do, to try to provide some more time so that states and their utilities could plan in a more comprehensive way. Looking, because I know what you and your companies do, you're looking far down the road and making decisions today about how you're going to invest that affect the company way into the future. And it's not helpful to have EPA or your state coming to you on a regular basis and saying, oh, oops, well, here's this other thing we need you to do in a short period of time. So where we can, we like to be able to find ways to bring those things together. And that's the impetus behind proposing to delay the plan submittal date. I'll tell you, not everybody is thrilled with that, and we will get a lot of comment telling us we shouldn't do that. But I know we'll get comments saying that that's a good idea and a sensible one too. So I'm sorry if I've gone on too long. I hope this has been somewhat interesting and helpful to you. I see that one of my colleagues is in the back of the room. I didn't know you were going to be here, Brian. So I hope you've gotten to know Brian. He's one of our stars on these issues. So I'm happy to take questions if there's still time, Bill.
Good morning.
Morning.
It's kind of timely that you were recently in China. I'm just kind of, the issue about the United States being a global leader. And, we've been working on mercury now for over 20 years and successfully developed all the technology, the means to even measure it below the original detection limit and control to it. And I'm just wondering, is the goal working in India, China, Asia? Are we influencing these other countries with what we're doing here?
That's a really good question, and I have to thank you for being the first person to ask a question too, because it's really sad to not get any questions. Things are amazing in China. It's a long way away, and when you're there, you realize just how far away you are from here. And I also realized, which just shows how insular we all are, how little I knew about this vast country with all these people in it. They have a real air pollution crisis over there. They have people wearing face masks. You can't see across the street there. And they have a lot of people there who are not happy about that. So they also have a very different form of government. They can affect change in different ways than we can. There is a lot going on at the national level government and at the sort of the equivalent of state, the provincial level government, to actually put controls on, to invest in renewable energy, and just on a massive scale. So I would say that while there's a lot of work to do, that there is progress being made, a lot of progress being made. There are a lot of American companies selling equipment and technology in China, working in China, which is a really good thing from a lot of fronts. Your federal government spends a lot of time on this, so it's not just EPA, it's the State Department, it's people who work directly for the president who understand how critical this is. I would say India is more challenging. They're not quite as far along. One of if you'll indulge me, this is a really great story. So I think we all understand that one of the characteristics of China has been a lack of information, public information, and access to public information. And we have embassies in China, of course, and some smart person, the people weren't able to get, China monitors their air quality, but the information wasn't available, and some smart person who worked at our embassy there said, well, why don't we put an air monitor on the American embassy and make that information public, because this is American soil. And so we did. Initially, the Chinese government was really unhappy about that. It was a tense situation. But we made that information available. And now, some years later, the Chinese have greatly expanded their air monitoring. That information is available. You walk around Chinese, everybody has a phone. They've got the app on there. And the United States is now taking this idea to other countries. So we have monitors on our embassies in cities in India and in Indonesia and in African countries and all over the world. So this is a very dramatic way in which we've influenced this issue, because when the people understand and can see the numbers, you see the air quality index. When I was there, the air quality index was up over 300, right? So that's a lot, and people pay attention to that, and then you get action. So long-winded answer, but yeah, it is making a difference.
I think our real problem's money, and I think that the EPA was implemented in the 70s, and since 80, the government has made a big policy of cutting taxes. So I assume that you are understaffed, underfunded, and we've got ratepayers that we assume aren't going to be happy with increases. So I'm wondering if you're doing what you are doing to push Congress to get more money and revise our attitude about spending money.
Well, that's an issue that's kind of bigger than me. And I think you've sort of pegged the dynamic that's out there. Not many administrations, governor, president, whoever, want to be the one that increase the size of government, but it is a true fact that the budgets of the agencies have gone down. The president every year puts a budget in. He works hard for the things that he thinks are important. He has asked for increases for EPA in each of the last 7 years, and then Congress, this is their deal under the Constitution to approve the budget. So they have done what they have done. One of the things that we recognize is it's not just about the money that government has to do our work. It's about the collective enterprise to do this work, and putting our energy into working with all of you to just be as smart as possible. And probably the chief example that I would cite is energy efficiency, which I know is sort of a weird thing to be talking to people whose job it is to produce electrons, but that's part of the dynamic of the industry, right? You're as much in the business of helping people not use your electrons as you are using your electrons. And what do they say? The cheapest megawatt is a negawatt. And the kinds of programs that are put in place to effectuate energy efficiency have all kinds of other positive social values in terms of people's quality of life, their bills, right? And so it achieves a lot of goals. So we continue to try to work on things like that, and people continue to innovate and bring technologies forward. The cost of solar and wind is going down, 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 and that's a really good thing. And the utility companies are helping to move that trend in a really good way. So I certainly don't have an answer to the systemic problem that you've identified, but being in the agency, and whatever we are allotted by Congress, we make the most of that, and that's why partnerships are so important to us.
Thinking about trading, carbon trading and all, and I know with CAMR, originally we were going to be able to trade mercury credits. And I believe part of the reason it was vacated because no, we don't want to do that. It's just moving emissions around. It just seems like we're going to go back to that same mode unless, I'm just kind of wondering why is carbon trading allowed when we have not done it on other emissions?
That's a really good question, because people might, in fact, wonder that. Why is trading okay for some pollutants and not for others? So there's a legal answer, and then I think there's kind of a real-world answer. Some pollutants are important in a very local sense, or a regional sense, or a countrywide or global sense, or all four. Some are more important in a local sense and not so important in a global sense. So with carbon, it is an international problem. It's a global problem. Carbon emissions are not affecting public health in a local sense. They're affecting it globally because of the huge mass of carbon across the entire globe. And so it doesn't matter so much where that reduction happens. It matters that it happens overall. So a trading system on a broad scale gets you the result that you want, and it actually gets you the result you want cheaper and more efficiently, because the bigger the pool, the more people that are playing, the cheaper it will be, right? And the more diversity of ways of getting there. With mercury, it is a global pollutant, but it also, science shows, has some more local deposition impacts on water bodies. And so a big trading system might address that global problem, but wouldn't address the local problem. And for other pollutants like other air toxics in particular, or lead's another great example. That's a very localized pollutant. It gets emitted, it comes right down. So you don't want to trade that across states. The legal answer is that the way Congress set up the Clean Air Act has different buckets for different kinds of pollutants. And for the toxic air pollutants, it is a facility-by-facility approach. I think in large part because toxics tend to have local impacts as well as broader impacts. And the mercury rule is required under that air toxics program. Acid rain was put in by Congress. Congress said this is going to be a big trading program because acid rain was a big regional program. We have found through our analytical work that doing this interstate transport rule for ozone and PM, it's also a regional issue. So if you reduce NOx regionally, you get the result that you want. So legal and science. Great question. Well, there's certainly programs out there that are thinking in those terms. I don't think we're at we don't even have it here yet. European Union has a trading program, and there's lots of conversations about how to do that. It gets pretty complex. It's complex enough to design it for a state or a country, and you want to make sure it's actually going to be legitimate and work. And the more people you have sort of in control of it or not in control of it, the harder it is for everybody to feel comfortable that it's actually happening. If I'm let me emit my carbon here because I promise you I'm planting 1,000 trees in Jakarta, it's a little hard for everybody to feel totally solid that that's going to get the result that you want. But maybe someday. Thank you very much. Enjoy your last day, and thanks for having me.